Well, here we go again. This is Gary Zacharias with the Apologist Bookshelf. I really appreciate you joining me today. We're back for, I think, a third look at a book by Mark Mittelberg. It's called The Questions Christians Hope No One Will Ask. And I may have mentioned it before. This would be the third time I've been doing a podcast on this. I may have mentioned before that this book was based on a survey done asking 1,000 Christians what are the questions that they hope never come up when they're around because they don't know how to handle them. And so these are the 10 questions. It's questions about evil and suffering. Why would we believe heaven and hell exist? Why do you condemn homosexuals? Why do you trust the Bible? It's full of myths, etc., etc. So I'd like to do question 1. And it's in chapter 1 because it's the place to start. What makes you so sure that God exists at all when you can't see, hear, or touch him? Yeah, well, that is a question. People do wonder about those things. He starts off talking about his own love with his wife, falling in love with her. He says, love is not a physical entity, but it's real. He says for people who are in love, it's maybe more real than the world around them. But he said, to know if there really is true love in a particular situation, sometimes you do need evidence. So he tells a story about him and Heidi. So let's pick it up now with the idea of God. He said that's the number one question people are afraid to deal with. How do you know there's a God? He's not tangible. You can't weigh him. You can't measure him, touch him. You can't see him with a naked eye. You can't detect him with a radar. Nothing. So he said, how did we respond to this? He said, well, we could point out that there are plenty of important things that we believe in that we don't see and hear or touch. And he gave the example that started the chapter, love. He said, love, it's a profound reality. Most of us do believe in love. But love isn't something that's material. You can't see it. You can't weigh it. And the Christian understanding that God is not material either. Jesus in John 4 says God is spirit. But we said, we do experience God in other ways. He said, if you're a follower, you've experienced God on a personal level. He said, I trust that you sense his presence and work in your life, at least on a periodic basis, certainly not all the time. And he said, God, he mentioned in his life, he said God has prompted him to speak to a person or to pray for somebody or send an encouraging note. And he said just that he knows God is real and active in our world. He said it's been active in my life. And he said, if you're a committed Christian, I'm sure you feel the same way. He said our testimony, when we're talking to other people, we can powerfully influence them, and especially people that know us and trust what we say. And it can influence people who have seen clear evidence of God's work in us. They can't see him, but they can see what he's done in our lives. We all know people who are struggling and had some terrible things going on and were terrible people themselves and became Christians, and what a change there was. So he said that's a powerful tool to talk about God's activity in our lives. But he said, some people are not going to be convinced. They'll say, well, you're sincere, but you're just taking some kind of coincidence and calling that God's intervention. So he said, there's some other ways that we could point to the effects of an invisible God. He said we could use examples that everybody can access. And so here come some of his evidences. Now, he has another book called Choosing Your Faith. And he said he presented 20 arguments for the Christian faith. And so here are some of those. He said we can make what's called a cumulative case. In other words, we may not feel that just one point is going to move everybody and cause them to become Christians. But he said we add them up. It's like if you're in a trial and you're a lawyer and you bring in 2 pieces of evidence. Is that going to be enough to convict somebody? No, probably not. But what if you had 20 pieces of evidence? You're building a cumulative case. And so that's what apologetics is all about, in my view, is creating a cumulative case for, in this case, for the existence of God. So he starts off with his first piece of evidence. It's called the cosmological argument. Now, he doesn't call it that, but it's just the fact that the universe exists. So he said, back in 1915, Albert Einstein came up with a general theory of relativity. And the theory was that the universe had a starting point, right? That was one of the implications of the theory. And if it had a beginning, it wasn't eternal, like Aristotle thought. Now, a lot of scientists didn't like the result of that. Really? There's going to be a beginning to the universe. That's kind of spooky. Starts sounding like Genesis, doesn't it? So they tried to find an error in the equations, but they couldn't. They couldn't find an error at all. We had the Hubble Space Telescope, and it said this telescope allowed, in fact, it's still up there now. It said allowed astronomers to see that the universe is expanding in great detail. They could see that. And the farther away a galaxy is, the faster it's moving. And so that does look like some kind of amazing explosion 13, 14 billion years ago. There's a beginning point, and that's when that expansion process happened. Now, how does that provide evidence for God? Well, if the universe had a starting point in history, then it began to exist. But if it began to exist, then it had to have a cause. Things don't just pop into existence, right? They don't begin to exist without a cause. Science operates on that principle. All events need a cause. Anything that's come into existence need a cause. But if the universe needs a cause, here's the catch, the cause has to be beyond the universe, because space, time, matter, and energy, that's the universe. So something beyond space and matter and time and energy had to bring into existence. Now, doesn't that start sounding like God? Yeah. But he said, somebody could say, yeah, well, how do you know it's God who created the universe? Maybe he's an alien. But Chad, his friend, was actually in a conversation like this. He said, well, yeah, could be an alien. But he said, this alien is timeless. He's outside of time. He's non-spatial. He's out of the spatial dimensions that we're in. He's immaterial. He's not made up of matter. And he doesn't consist of physical energy, but he created the entire universe, billions and billions of stars. Said, I think that's Yahweh. That's the transcendent God that's beyond space and time. That's what Christians have believed in for 2,000 years. Now, Mittelberg says even Richard Dawkins, a real atheist, admitted in an article published in Time magazine, there could be something incredibly grand and incomprehensible and beyond our present understanding. And somebody said, well, doesn't that look like God? He says, yes, but it could be any of a billion gods. It could be the God of the Martians or the inhabitants of Alpha Centauri. He says the chance of it being a particular God, Yahweh, the God of Jesus, that's vanishingly small. But Mittelberg says, you could say to Dawkins, well, you can call him what you want, but the evidence from the origin of the universe tells us a lot about what he's like. It sure sounds like what the Bible talks about, the God who is Yahweh, the God of Jesus, the creator of the world. Of course, then Mittelberg has a really good point here. He said people come up with another objection to this idea of God causing the universe as well. If everything needs a cause, then who caused God? But Mittelberg says, no, that's not what the argument says. The argument doesn't say everything needs a cause, just everything that has a beginning has to have a cause. Well, the universe had to have, apparently had a beginning, and so that would be God, right? But God has no beginning. He doesn't have a cause or need a cause. So here's the cosmological evidence in kind of a series of statements, which I like. Mittelberg makes it simple. Whatever begins to exist has to have a cause for its existence. Number two, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has to have a cause. Now, the attributes of this cause that have to be timeless, existing outside of space, and on, those are the attributes of God. Conclusion, the cause of the universe must be God. I think that's a really strong argument. Here's argument number two that Mittelberg deals with. His second piece of evidence, we live in what he calls a just so universe, sometimes called the teleological argument. There's the fancy word, or the design argument. And Mittelberg says, take a look at Psalm 19:1. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. So he said, what we're finding out is that the building blocks of our world, the laws and the physical constants that govern all of the matter and all the way across the universe, have to be precisely balanced and finely tuned for life to occur and flourish. Isn't that something? He says scientists have discovered lots of these parameters and constants. And the last I heard, reading some material by Hugh Ross, Reasons to Believe, he said there are over several hundred now, that these parameters and constants have to be exactly right. So Mittelberg says, why don't we just take one example? You've got four forces in nature. One of them is the force of gravity. So he says physicists have calculated that all of these forces have to fall within a specific range or there'd be no conscious life here. So, for example, he says if the force of gravity were to change by, catch this, 1 part in 10,000 billion billion billion, relative to all of the range of the strengths that it could be, conscious life would be virtually impossible. What about another one? What about the neutron? If it's not exactly 1.001 times the mass of the proton, then all protons would have decayed into neutrons, or all neutrons would have decayed into protons, and life would be impossible. If the explosion of the Big Bang had differed in strength by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 60th, now that's 1 part in a trillion, 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 the universe would either have collapsed and just become one big gob of something, or expanded too swiftly to get stars. So you'd have no life at all. Now these parameters, these constants, are independent of each other. So they're exactly what they should be, and every one has to be exactly what they should be. Now Paul Davies, who's not a Christian, he's a leading physicist and cosmologist, he said, I can't believe that our existence in this universe is a mere quirk of fate. We are truly meant to be here. Now he doesn't believe in a personal God, so I don't know exactly how he gets around that. He said, so there are characteristics of a planet that have to be exactly right. So, for example, we have to have the correct mass. You have to have a certain size moon going around us. You have to have a certain kind of magnetic field. You have to have an atmosphere that has just the right amount of oxygen. You have to orbit a certain kind of star. You got to be in the right galactic habitable zone, and it goes on and on and on. These factors have to be exactly right, or we don't get life. Well, some people say, okay, we don't want to go that direction, right? So maybe there's an alternate theory to explain how these phenomena ended up exactly right. So first is, maybe there are a lot of other universes besides ours, right? So, infinite number of universes. So out of all of these millions and millions and millions of universes, we just lucked out. One happened to be just right. We just hit the jackpot. Okay, so if you had these universes and they're all produced randomly, most of them would be life prohibiting. But if you get enough of them, then just by sheer chance, maybe it works out okay. But Mittelberg says, here's a huge problem. There's no scientific evidence that it's true or even possible. It's just speculative. How do you know there's another alternate universe? How would you find it? We're confined to this universe. He said, another problem is if you have an infinite number of universes, there's got to be some kind of mini-universe generator, and it would have to produce these. And it'd have to produce each one being slightly different. So how does it do that? What kind of intelligence could account for such an astounding machine? Now here's another objection that he hears. Well, if the evidence points to a divine designer, who designed the designer? Said, well, that misses the point. The universe is better explained by design than by chance. Yeah. I always think of illustration as somebody once said, if you're walking along the ocean and you see an imprint of a shoe, you say, oh, this is man-made, this is something specifically designed. Somebody might say, well, yeah, but who designed the shoe? Who made the shoe? That's not the point. The point is the shoe made a design. And so we can say the universe has a certain design that's exactly right. Here's evidence number 3. Here's a third kind of argument that you can make, talking about the beginning of the universe, and now we're talking about how designed everything is. So evidence 3. This is how he says it, a morally good universe. This is called the moral argument. So he mentions some good things that have happened. People have raised money for an earthquake disaster. Parents adopted some special needs kids that he was reading about. Somebody donated a kidney to save a local grocery store cashier. So he said, how do we decide these things? We say, oh, those are so wonderful. But on what basis do we call something good or evil? How do we call something right or wrong? Did that start with the Big Bang? No, moral values don't come out of physical explosions. Where did they come from? And Mark Mittelberg says atheists are really hard-pressed to say there are objective moral values. Where did they come from? Yeah. So he said it's the problem of good. That's a major challenge for atheism. There's no way to explain objective moral values. He has a quote here. One atheist wrote this, secularism's ongoing debt to Christianity. This is a long quote, but I think it's worth hearing. Although I'm a secularist, atheist, if you will, I accept that the great majority of people would be morally and spiritually lost without religion. Can anyone seriously argue that crime and debauchery are not held in check by religion? Is it not comforting to live in a community where the rule of law and fairness are respected? Would such be likely if Christianity were not there to provide a moral compass to the great majority? Do we secularists not benefit all out of proportion from a morally responsible society? An orderly society, now this is still the atheist talking, an orderly society is dependent on generally accepted morality, and there can be no such morality without religion. Has there ever been a more perfect and concise moral code than the one Moses brought down from the mountain? Again, this is the last part of the secularist talking. Those who doubt the effect of religion on morality should seriously ask the question, just what are the immutable moral laws of secularism? Be prepared to answer if you're honest that such laws do not exist. The best answer we can ever hear from secularists to this question is a hodgepodge of strained relativistic talk of situational ethics. They can cite no overriding authority other than that of fashion. For the great majority in the West, it's the Judeo-Christian tradition which offers a template. So I think that's really a good point. He said, back to Mittelberg now, he said, we know murder and rape and bigotry and racism. These things are wrong. They're really wrong. Not just to me or to my friend or to just a few people. They're wrong for everybody, regardless of our background. But where do we get this knowledge, this sense of right and wrong? If we didn't invent it, if it transcends our culture, it transcends politics, then what's its source? Well, the best source would be a moral lawgiver. So the Christian has a solid basis for objective moral values. Why? Because Christians believe God exists. He's a supreme, transcendent, divine person. Goodness flows from his nature. Moral values are not invented by us. They're discovered. They're grounded in the nature of a good, loving, personal God. And so at the end of that section, he says, here we go. Here's the form of a simple argument regarding morality. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. But we know objective moral values do exist. Therefore, you know where this is going, therefore God does exist. Now he's saying, don't get me wrong, atheists can live moral lives. He said, yes, they can. But recognizing it and living by it doesn't mean that you have a basis for it. So that's really good. I like that a lot. Now, at the end of each of his chapters, I like what he does. He does a summary. So he has a summary of the answers. Then he has tips for talking about this issue. Things like if your friends don't believe in God and they seem angry about it, ask why. Try to help them understand that what's done in God's name or in religious circles is not from God. That's from imperfect people. He said realize there may be some deeper personal issues why people are not interested in God or believing in God. He said ask questions and then listen to what they say. And he says you could refer to the Bible's teachings, but just keep in mind a lot of people don't accept its authority or truthfulness. And then he said toward the end of the section here on tips, these discussions aren't just about logic and good answers, but also about a spiritual struggle. Pray that God would direct your words and attitude. And he said, let love be your motivation. And then at the very end, the last section he's got, I like this a lot, he calls it questions for group discussion. So something like this. What are some things you can talk about from your own experience that show you that God really exists? Here's another one. How does the fact that our universe had a beginning or that it's fine-tuned provide evidence for God? Here's the third question. Do you think there could be objective morality apart from God? Where would it draw its authority? And then question 4 gets really personal here. How has the evidence for God presented in this chapter affected your faith? Can evidence strengthen one's faith? Now, I'd think the answer to that one, can evidence strengthen one's faith? Absolutely. So this is Mark Mittelberg. He's a best-selling author, a leading strategist, and doing apologetics-oriented outreach for people. And I like his material a lot. It's easy to read. It's not over anybody's head, but he takes on some pretty serious issues here. So it's called The Questions Christians Hope No One Will Ask. Well, now I hope you feel a little more confident. This is the third podcast on this. And this book, by the way, has been out for, 12 years or so. So there are bound to be some used copies places where you could pick one up really cheap. It's worth it. It's a good book to have on your shelf. Well, I appreciate you being part of this. I hope it's been helpful to you, and we'll do another podcast soon. Thanks.